Hello, and welcome to the Street Crime America's YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Today, we look at the life of a notorious American criminal who will never be forgotten about in the American criminal underworld. Salvatore Maranzano. Salvatore Maranzano, born on July 31st, 1886, was an organised crime figure from the town of Castellammarese, Sicily, and an early Cosa Nostra boss who led what later would become the Bonanno crime family in New York City. Mr. Maranzano instigated the Castellammarese War in 1930 to seize control of the American Mafia, winning the war after the murder of rival faction head Joseph Masseria in April 1931. Mr. Maranzano then briefly became the Mafia's capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and formed the Five Families in New York City, but was murdered on September 10, 1931, on the orders of Charles Lucky Luciano, who established an arrangement in which families shared power to prevent future turf wars. Salvatore Maranzano was the youngest of 12 children born to Domenico Maranzano and Antonia Pisciotta. As a youngster, Mr. Maranzano had wanted to become a priest and even studied to become one, but later became associated with the Mafia in his homeland. Mr. Maranzano had a very commanding presence and was greatly respected by his underworld peers. He had a fascination with Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, and enjoyed talking to his less educated American Mafia counterparts about these subjects. Because of this, Mr. Maranzano was nicknamed Little Caesar by his underworld peers. Mr. Maranzano emigrated from Sicily to the United States in the 1920s, settling in Brooklyn. The Sicilian mafioso Don Vito Ferro decided to make a bid for control of mafia operations in the United States. From his base in Castellammarese Mr. Maranzano was sent to seize control. While building a legitimate business as a real estate broker, Mr. Maranzano also maintained a growing bootlegging business, using the real estate company as a front for his illegal activities. He soon became involved in prostitution and the illegal smuggling of narcotics. He also took a liking to young Joseph Bonanno and became his mentor. To protect the criminal empire that Mr. Maranzano had built up, he declared war on his rival Joe Masseria, the boss of all bosses, in 1930, by starting the Castellammarese War. In a secret deal with Mr. Maranzano, Mr. Luciano agreed to engineer Mr. Masseria's death in return for receiving Mr. Masseria's rackets and becoming Mr. Maranzano's second in command. On April the 15th, Mr. Luciano invited Mr. Masseria and two other associates to lunch in a Coney Island restaurant. After finishing their meal, the mobsters decided to play cards. At that point, according to the mob legend, Mr. Luciano went to the bathroom. Four gunmen, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, then walked into the dining room and shot and killed Mr. Masseria. With Mr. Maranzano's blessing, Mr. Luciano took over Mr. Masseria's gang and became Mr. Maranzano's lieutenant. With Mr. Masseria gone, Mr. Maranzano reorganized the Italian-American gangs in New York City into the Five Families. Headed by Mr. Luciano, Joe Profesci, Tommy Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, and himself. Each family would have a boss, underboss, capos, soldiers, and associates, and would be a company of full-blooded Italian-Americans, while associates could come from any background. However, Mr. Maranzano called a meeting of crime bosses in New York and declared himself capo di capi, the boss of all bosses. Mr. Luciano appeared to accept these changes, but was merely biding his time before removing Mr. Maranzano. Although Mr. Maranzano was slightly more forward-thinking than Mr. Masseria, Mr. Luciano had come to believe that Mr. Maranzano was even more greedy than Mr. Masseria had been. Mr. Maranzano's scheming, his arrogant treatment of his subordinates, and his fondness for comparing his organisation to the Roman Empire. Mr. Maranzano attempted to model the organisation after Caesar's military chain of command. It didn't sit well with Mr. Luciano and Mr. Luciano's ambitious friends such as Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and others. Despite Mr. Maranzano's advocacy for modern methods of organisation, including crews of soldiers doing the bulk of a family's illegal work under the supervision of a capo regime, at heart Mr. Maranzano was a moustache Pete, an old-school mafioso too steeped in old-world ways. Mr. Maranzano was opposed to Mr. Luciano's partnership with Jewish gangsters such as Meyer Langsy and Mr. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Mr. Luciano and his colleagues had intended all along to bide their time before getting rid of Mr. Maranzano. By September 1931, Mr. Maranzano realised that Mr. Luciano was a threat and hired Vincent Mad Dog Cole, an Irish gangster, to kill him. However, Tommy LaCheese alerted Mr. Luciano that he was marked for death. On September the 10th, Mr. Maranzano ordered Mr. Luciano and Genovese to come to his office at the New York Central Building, now the Helmsley Building, at 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan. Convinced that Mr. Maranzano planned to murder them, Mr. Luciano decided to act first. Mr. Luciano sent to Maranzano's office 4 Jewish gangsters whose faces were unknown to Mr. Maranzano's people. They had been secured with the aid of Mr. Lanksey and Mr. Siegel. Disguised as government agents, 2 of the gangsters disarmed Mr. Maranzano's bodyguards. The other 2, who were aided by Mr. LaCheese, who was there to point out Mr. Maranzano, stabbed the boss multiple times before shooting him. This assassination was the first of what would later be fabled as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Although there would have been few objections and Mr. Luciano declared himself Capo di tutti i capi, he abolished the title, believing the position created trouble among the families and would make himself a target for another ambitious challenger. Mr. Luciano subsequently created the Commission to serve as the governing body for organised crime. Mr. Maranzano is buried in St. John's Cemetery, Queens, New York, near Mr. Luciano's grave. Mr. Maranzano plays a small fictionalized role in Mario Puzo's The Godfather. Mr. Maranzano refused Don Vito Corleone's proposal to share his monopoly on gambling in New York City, in exchange for police and political contacts and expansion into Brooklyn and the Bronx. Mr. Maranzano arranged for 2 of Al Capone's gunmen to come to New York and finish Corleone. Through Mr. Capone's contacts in Chicago, Mr. Corleone found out and sent Luca Brasi to murder the gunman. With Mr. Capone out of the picture, the Great Mob War of 1933 had begun. Desperate for peace, Mr. Maranzano agreed to sit down in a restaurant in Brooklyn, where he was killed by Salvatore Tessio, a capo in the Corleone family. Afterwards, Mr. Corleone took over Mr. Maranzano's organisation and held a meeting to reorganise the American Mafia, something that the real-life Mr. Maranzano did. In the 1972 film The Valachi Papers, Mr. Maranzano is portrayed by Joseph Wiseman. In the 1981 NBC miniseries The Gangster Chronicles, Mr. Maranzano is portrayed by Joseph Mascolo. In the 1990 film Mobsters, Mr. Maranzano is portrayed by Michael Gambon. In the 1999 film Lansky, Mr. Maranzano is portrayed by Ron Gilbert. In the 1999 Lifetime film Bonanno, A Godfather's Story, Mr. Maranzano is portrayed by Edward James Olmos. In the 2011 Torchwood episode Immortal Sins, Mr. Maranzano is portrayed by Chris D'Annunzio. In the 5th season of Boardwalk Empire, Mr. Maranzano is portrayed by Giampiero Giudice. So, what are your thoughts on the crimes committed by Salvatore Maranzano? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.